guys, happy Thursday. We're gonna go over chapter 4. Please be sure that you follow along and you answer the comments or the questions that I ask you in the comment section below. Grab a coffee, grab a drink, and your book, and let's get started. I know you're super excited to be watching another video today, but again, we just really can't afford to get further behind. Chapter 4 is kind of where our action starts to pick up a little bit. We encounter Paul for the first time on the front line. Now, obviously, Paul had been on the front line before. It's just the first time that we have encountered it with him. At the beginning of chapter 4, they are sent on a job called the wiring fatigue, where they would be given either barbed wire or communication wire to restring across the front line. This is something that had to be done regularly because of frequent bombardments, and the wiring had to be replaced. So Paul and his company are asked to go on this wiring fatigue, and they hop on the lorries, which is just kind of an open-backed truck where everyone could stand up. It was the fastest and most efficient way to travel to the front line. They head to the front line. If you remember, Mueller from chapter 2 is wearing new boots because Kenrich had told Paul, when Kenrich realized he was going to die, he told Paul, make sure you give Mueller my boots. So Mueller is wearing new boots, and they are off to the front. Kat kind of picks up on something in the air and knows that a bombardment is coming. And to try to, I guess, educate the recruitments a little bit better, because if you remember, most of their training off the front lines has to do with marching formations or saluting or, these kind of repetitive drills that really would not do them a whole lot of good on the front line. And so on their way to the front line, Kat and Paul and the other veterans of the war kind of educate the recruits on things like, oh, this type of explosion comes from this type of weapon, or when you hear this, there's no need to be afraid because it's too far away, or when it sounds like this, that's when you need to duck because it's headed straight for us. These are the types of things that would be more important for the recruits to know rather than, march in a straight line, or this is how you salute, or, duck and cover when at this certain point, learning the sounds of the weapons or knowing when to truly be afraid and when not to be afraid is more important for survival on the front line than it would be to know how to salute or to march properly. He kind of gets sucked into this whirlpool that is the front. He describes it, he's right now, he's in still water, but the closer he gets to the front, that whirlpool just kind of pulls him in. And I think he kind of means there that you can't get pulled in, you can't help but be pulled into this need and necessity to survive. The closer that you get to the front, you get kind of pulled into the environment, you get pulled into the hype and the adrenaline and the energy of the front, and you can't help it. If you try to resist, you're most likely going to die. If you allow yourself to kind of be sucked in, you maybe have a chance for survival. And following that point, when Paul talks about being sucked in by this whirlpool of the front, his tone kind of suddenly changes. So far in our book, Paul has been very reflexive, thinking back on the meanings of war, the necessity of war, the loss of innocence, the fact that the bitterness that he kind of carries. We see all that come out in his dialogue, but then all of a sudden, as he gets to the front, he becomes more symbolic and much more spiritual in his conversation. He notices the earth, and he talks about the earth. I'm just going to read this portion with you because I feel like it is really important to understand and to analyze, because it's just kind of that one point in the book where his tone and his voice changes quite drastically compared to what we had been seeing in Paul so far. So if you'll turn with me to page 55 in your book, we're at that second paragraph. on page 55 in chapter 4. From the earth, from the air, sustaining forces pour into us, mostly from the earth. To no man does the earth mean so much as to the soldier. When he presses himself down upon her long and powerfully, when he buries his face and his limbs deep in her from fear of death by shell fire, then she is his only friend, his brother, his mother. He stifles his terror and cries in her silence and her security. She shelters him and releases him for 10 seconds to live, to run, 10 seconds of life. Receives him again and often forever. Earth, 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 thy folds and hollows and holes into which a man may fling himself and crouch down, in the spasms of terror under the howling of annihilation and the bellowing death of the explosions. O earth, thou grantest us the greatest resisting surge of new-won life. Our being, almost utterly carried away by the fury of the storm, streams back through our hands from thee, and we, thy redeemed ones, bury ourselves in thee, and through the long minutes, in a mute agony of hope, bite into thee with our lips. And his tone again really changes. He begins to almost pray to the earth. I want you to tell me, what is the significance of this change in his tone, the change of his voice? It's kind of one of the only parts in our book that his voice seems to change so much. You know, his tone will change, and Paul's attitude will change, his character changes. This is the one time that his voice really changes in our book. And he begins to pray. He prays to the earth. Why is the earth so important to him? And why does he kind of all of a sudden take this moment to pray to the earth? Is it a desperate plea, or is it a praise? A prayer of thankfulness, but he is unashamedly admitting to the terror and the fear that most soldiers fear during a bombardment specifically. A lot of times when we think of soldiers, especially those who are fighting on the front lines, we think of people who are strong and brave and courageous. And not saying that soldiers aren't strong and brave and courageous, but Paul really reveals the terror and the fright that he feels with being on the front lines. So much so that he buries himself in the earth, not literally buries, but, flattens himself to the earth and hides his screams of terror in the earth. And then, he says the earth releases them for 10 seconds to stand up and run, 10 seconds to live before they have to dive down and flat on the earth again. Tell me the significance of this prayer that Paul makes to the earth. What kind of winds up being that almost relationship of soldiers with the earth. We think that Paul is very close to his friends, but he said in that moment of terror, earth is a soldier's only friend, and earth is a soldier's brother, a soldier's mother. Everything else kind of ceases to exist, but the soldier and the earth. So kind of, explain that to me. Why is that prayer so significant? And what does it do for the purpose of the book? And then he kind of gets snaps out of it as he hears the first sound of the shells. And then he says, by the animal instinct that is awakened in us, we are led and protected. Okay, so we'll hear several times about how on the front specifically, or during the war, when they are fighting, they begin to kind of lose their humanity. He says on an animal instinct. It's not even something that I think about. It's not something that could have been drilled into me. It is this animalistic instinct to survive. That is what drives these boys on the front line, is that animalistic instinct to immediately survive. They do what is necessary to survive. He explains it here. He tells us one cannot explain it. A man is walking along without thought or heed, and suddenly he throws himself down on the ground, and a storm of fragments flies harmlessly over him. Yet he cannot remember either to have heard the shell coming or have thought of flinging himself down. But had he not abandoned himself to the impulse, he would now be a heap of mangled flesh. So it's kind of this experience, this kind of second nature experience that they get from being on the front. For some unknown reason, they just all of a sudden fling themselves to the ground, and shells explode around them, and they're able to jump back up and move on. And he doesn't even remember hearing the shell in the distance, or even thinking about diving. He just gives into that instinct and gives into that impulse to take cover. And because of that instinct and because of that impulse, he survives. almost last paragraph on page 56. He said, "We march up, moody and good-tempered soldiers. We reach the zone where the front begins and become, on the instant, human animals." He said, all humanity is left behind us, because when we get to the front, humanity does us no good. That animal instinct is what protects us and what helps us survive. So we are good-natured soldiers. We are having a good time. We are laughing. We might be a little bit moody coming up. We are human on our way to the front. But once we meet the front, we are instantly animals. As they reach the front, they start to see the other soldiers, and Paul describes them as a column, not men, but just a column, a single unit. He recognizes them in their unanimity. They're no longer individuals. They're no longer human. They are a column. They are soldiers. They are there to fight. And again, we see that repetition of the loss of humanity in the midst of war. They reach the front, and again, Cat feels that strong urging that he knows the bombardment is coming. And then they start running the wire. They stick the stakes in at regular intervals to run the wire. It takes them a few hours to run it, and then they get back, and Paul falls asleep for a little while because they have to wait for the lorries to return to pick them up to take them back to the huts behind the lines. All of a sudden, Paul is woken up by shells exploding kind of suddenly. He's surprised that he is so startled by this, and he wakes up and he feels his face, and he kind of asks us, "Am I crying?" And he touches his face to see if he's crying, and all of a sudden he's really shocked by what he feels when he touches his face. He's, am I crying? Am I a child? On page 60, he wakes up and says, "I don't know whether it is morning or evening. I lie in the pale cradle of the twilight and listen for soft words which will come, soft and near. Am I crying? I put my hand to my eyes. It is so fantastic. Am I a child? Smooth skin." It lasts only a second, then I recognize the silhouette of Kaczynski. When he touches his face, he's really surprised by what he feels. Again, on the inside, he feels like a soldier. And mentally, emotionally, he feels like a soldier. But as soon as he touches his face, he's surprised by the smoothness of it. If his face is smooth, obviously he can't grow a beard or facial hair yet. And he thinks, am I a child? And he's kind of surprised by this. It's like, I know I'm a soldier, but when I touch my face, I feel like a child. And he's confused for just a minute. Then when he recognizes Cat, he understands where he is. And again, Remarque, our author, shows this contrast or this paradox of the innocence of these boys and the situation that they are being put in. Remarque really feels that, if a soldier reaches up and he touches his face and he feels like a child, then he is a child. He shouldn't have to be in these situations. And we see a similar situation again. Shortly after Paul wakes up, the bombardment begins. And Cat, kind of braces himself since we're in for it. And at this point, it's every man for himself. And the shells start exploding, and Paul notices one of the recruits, and he's still. He's scared stiff. And just shocked by everything that's going on, and his helmet falls off, and Paul runs over and grabs his helmet because he wants to help this kid. He wants to make sure this kid survives, and he tries to shove the helmet back on the kid's head, and the kid shoves it off. He doesn't want it, and as Paul's trying to help him, the kid runs up and nuzzles into Paul's chest, and we think that might be a little bit odd, but this kid, in all essence, he is a child. This kid is terrified. You get this image of when little kids are scared, maybe they've had a bad dream or they watched a scary movie, and they come and nuzzle up under their parent, kind of like scoot under their arm and cuddle. Basically, is what this soldier has done to Paul. And he says on page 61, "And like a child creeps under my arm, his head close to my breast, the little shoulders heave." He describes them as little shoulders. Shoulders of a child, and not out of cruelty, but Paul takes the helmet and puts it over the soldier's rear end. And not to be mean or to make fun of the kid, but because his rear end is sticking up in the air and it needs to be protected. And then the attack ends, and they're quiet. And Paul kind of, reassuringly tells the soldier, "You'll be okay. You'll get used to it after time." And then the soldier realizes something all of a sudden. Tell me down below why the soldier is really, really embarrassed. And Paul kind of brushes it off. He's like, "It's okay. Take care of it." After the bombardment, everything kind of starts to quiet down, and they hear this kind of incessant groaning and crying and screaming. At first, they think it's wounded soldiers, but then they realize it's wounded horses. Kind of a really terrible scene. If you've ever heard a wounded animal, it is horrendous. And he describes it as it's unendurable. It is the moaning of the world. It is the martyred creation, wild with anguish, filled with terror and groaning. And it's kind of, to them, it amplifies the pain and the fear and the disconnectedness of the whole situation. And Dietrich especially gets very, very upset. He's a farmer, and he just feels it is so wrong to use such innocent animals in the war. And I think in this way, the author paints a picture for us. If Dietrich feels it's so wrong to use something so innocent and beautiful as horses, how much worse possibly is it to use innocent boys in a war like this? And finally, they take care of them, but they had to take care of the men first, so almost to the point where the men go insane listening to these animals scream. Someone finally takes care of it and puts the animals out of their misery. As they get back to the lorries and they've kind of cleaned up and everything, a second bombardment comes. We think that Paul is kind of out of danger, and then a second bombardment comes. And ironically, they are about to head through a graveyard when the bombardment hits. I want you to tell me below the significance of that. What do you think the author is trying to communicate? Paul takes cover in an open grave. A shell explodes in an open grave, and he ducks down into it in order to take cover. I mentioned briefly kind of the relationship that soldiers have with the earth. Using this image of Paul hiding in a casket, hiding in a blown up grave, describe the relationship of the soldiers with death itself. I think this image, this scene, really paints a good picture of a soldier's relationship with death, how they fear it, but at times they kind of embrace it as well. So explain that below for me, please. During the bombardment, something else comes. The gas, the mustard gas. Yesterday I asked you to comment on why the gas masks were needed, and it was because of the mustard gas. It was kind of a nerve gas that would choke them and cause convulsions and things like that. And they have to get out of the trenches or out of the blown up holes in the earth because that's where the gas would settle. After the bombardment, they're helping gather the wounded and the dead, and Paul comes across the same recruit that he helped earlier. And he has a wound and he's laying on his stomach, and Paul and Kat say, if it's his stomach, he's gone for it. There's nothing we can do to help him. So they flip him over and they realize that he's been shot in the hip. And when they pull back the clothing and reveal the hip, he says on page 71, "It is one mass of mincemeat and bone splinters." Hey, it is just exploded. The joint is gone, and this poor boy is never going to be able to walk again or sit up. And they try to dress it how they can, and when they flip him over, they realize that his arm is also wounded. And they try to help him as much as they can, and they get him bandaged with the bandages and dressings that they have, and then they tell him, wait here, we are going to get a stretcher. And the boy just freaks out, and understandably so. He doesn't want to be left alone with such a horrendous injury. And then Kat, he kind of looks around and he says, "Don't you think we should just take care of it and end it here?" He pulls out his revolver and says, "Do you think we should end it here?" And Paul thinks about it, and he realizes, yeah, I think we do need to end it here. Because right now, this soldier, this young recruit, he's high on adrenaline, he's kind of in shock, and but once he starts to get that feeling back, and once he is sitting in the hospital, he is going to be in such pain, and his life is never going to be the same. If he's even survives the hospital. So why not just end it now? And Kat is prepared to end it, but before he can take the shot, other people show up and they get a stretcher. And as they're taking the boy out on the stretcher, Kat shakes his head. On page 73, it says, Kat shakes his head. Such a kid, he repeats. Young innocence. I mean, why you think Kat regrets letting the boy live more than he would have if he would have taken care of it with the revolver. And they kind of gather all their supplies. They head back to the lorries. They realize it was quite, in fact, a short bombardment, not the worst bombardment that they have experienced. They climb back into the lorries and they head out. They are so exhausted. They're kind of in this state of half sleep, and they're kind of droned to sleep by the rocking of the lorry. And they move only when someone says mind the wires, and they kind of duck down so they don't get chopped in the throat by the communication wires that drape across the roads. That kind of finishes up chapter 4. Please make sure you're answering the questions below and keep up with our homework. Again, I apologize for making you have to watch these on your days off, but we really can't afford to get farther behind. I hope you're enjoying the snow. You've had a chance to get out and play in it or have some fun with it. You're not stuck inside all day. Enjoy reading your book. Check out chapter 5, the next video. I should have it up tomorrow at some point. Have a great weekend. Thank you for putting up with me with these videos. I know they're not fantastic, but I'm trying my best. So if you have any suggestions on how to make them better, I would love to hear. You can put that in the comments as well. Have fun, build a snowman, be safe, stay warm. I'll see you later.